Other than a faint glow coming from one of the back rooms, the town's charity shop was in darkness, its front door firmly closed. Although it had opened in 1985, the building had been used commercially since the 1800s, when it had variously been a pharmacy, a bank, and a tavern. The shop was close to the river in Marbleton, a pleasant English market town, which had once been home to a nearby priory. In ancient times, monks had wandered back and forth to sell their wares at a market which still existed in diminished form across the road. Regulars were now peering through the shop window, but the main lights stayed off. A few of the shop's helpers were huddled in the back room. Patrick, the treasurer, had collected the spare keys from the greengrocer to let them in. The gatherers were addressing one topic, namely, why their long-serving manager, Ray, had failed to open up the day before. "I just can't understand it," Ivy, one of the shop's founding members, said. "I've never known her not to turn up, unless she's on holiday. In all the years I've known Ray, she's never had a day's sickness." "Wasn't she going to New Zealand to visit her sister?" Patrick asked. "She was, but not until the following week. It's in the shop diary. Here, take a look." Ivy tapped the relevant pages meaningfully. "I'm not doubting you, Ivy, but she may have got the dates wrong. She wasn't in the habit of making mistakes." Ivy's loyalty knew no bounds. Patrick adopted a different approach. "You've tried Ria's landline, I take it?" "Several times. Each time it went straight to answer phone." "Right. Still, I expect we're worrying over nothing. But you have to admit, she has been a bit distracted lately." Someone piped up. Patrick turned to Silvana hopefully, but she shook her head. "I've tried her on her mobile, but nothing." Silvana was a refugee who had joined the shop 2 years earlier. Since Rhea had taken her under her wing when she first came to England, her English had improved markedly. Silvana had been on the verge of admitting her true feelings for Rhea. Reality had crushed the likelihood of her returning to her homeland anytime soon, and been replaced by something entirely unexpected, an overwhelming love for another human being. Silvana's great wish was to know whether that love was returned. Rhea clearly liked her, but was it worth risking their friendship for more? The path to such an admission seemed littered with obstacles. Now, the mystery of Rhea's whereabouts could be added to an already growing list. "Did Rhea say anything about changing her holiday plans, Silvana?" Patrick asked, determined to get to the bottom of things. "No. I went to her house for my lesson last Wednesday. She told me she'd be away all next week." Silvana had considered the matter carefully. "Yes, that is so." Patrick said. "I guess I'll have to contact the area manager about reopening the shop." "You'll need to do that. Volunteer phone numbers are stored in the locked cabinet, and only Ray has the key," Ivy interjected. "Head office have contact numbers too." Everyone knew Rhea always carried a set of keys on a fob, attached to a waistband. Patrick joked she secretly had a cellar key for the shop's more trying customers, to which he'd received an enigmatic smile. The actual cellar key had supposedly vanished in the mists of time. Certainly, there was no call to use the cellar with ample storage space elsewhere. In any case, the cellar door was kept permanently locked, preventing anyone getting trapped if there was a fire. Patrick scrutinized the rota sheets. "Maybe Judd would be willing to help if we reopen the shop," he suggested. Silvana, who distrusted Judd, said nothing. Whatever. 3 months earlier, dressed in black jeans and hoodie and trailed by a mournful cocker spaniel, Judd had shown up to inquire about volunteering. When Silvana had bent to pat his dog, it had backed off whimpering. "She gets nervous round new people," Judd had explained. Tucking away the banking money, Patrick had gone to fetch Rhea. "A young man's inquiring about volunteering," he told her. "Shall I send him through?" "What's he like?" Rhea was wearily tapping information into the computer at her desk. He seems pleasant enough. His dog's rather nervous. Rhea massaged her aching neck. Send him through, she said. Rhea had confided in Silvana about her difficulty in getting references for Judd Digdeep. Eventually he'd presented her with 2 typed ones, supposedly from an ex-employer. With typical thoroughness, Rhea had rung one of the numbers to learn more about the new helper. When a voice answered sounding suspiciously like Judd's, she'd intended to investigate further. However, other things had intervened. A few weeks after this uncharacteristic omission, Judd was indeed proving to be an asset. Willing to turn his hand to anything, it was a relief not having to lift heavy sacks and boxes donated by the public from one end of the shop to the other. With little guidance, Judd had transformed one of the sorting rooms, leaving it immaculate. One evening, when Silvana cycled past the back of the shop, she noticed a group of undesirables hanging with Judd, engrossed in conversation. She hurried past, hoping she hadn't been seen. She raised her concerns to Rhea, who told her it was nothing to worry about, that she'd keep an eye on things, and bafflingly added, "I'd rather you didn't mention this to anyone else." The day the shop reopened, without Rhea at the helm, was Silvana's birthday. Patrick invited her to join him later for one of his wife's specials, homemade pizza and pear wine. The food tasted delicious, but she pushed her plate to one side. "You're still worried about Rhea, aren't you?" Patrick observed. "Her cell phone is dead. It's strange. I knocked on her door last night, but still no answer." Patrick got up. "I tell you what. I happen to know Rhea's neighbor, Angela, from the book club. She looks after the garden when Rhea goes away. She may well have a spare key. I'm sure there's nothing to worry about, but it wouldn't do any harm to check if everything is all right." Silvana was relieved. "That's a great idea, thanks Patrick. I've been known to have a few in my time. Come on, get your coat. Let's see if we can solve this mystery." Half an hour later, the pair were standing in Rhea's house. The hallway led into an open-plan kitchen diner with gleaming countertops and state-of-the-art gadgets. The smell of coffee lingered invitingly. When Rhea's partner Lindsay had died 5 years earlier, she'd left her with a generous insurance payout. Silvana sighed, remembering the other day when she and Rhea had drawn close over a bottle of wine. Rhea had even given her a present. "Only to be opened on your birthday," she instructed. But beneath the gaiety, she'd been out of sorts. Rhea had brushed aside Silvana's offer of help with a brisk, "I'm fine. I'll check down here if you do upstairs," Patrick said, jolting Silvana back to the present. The passport was lying on the bedside table. However, the photograph bore little resemblance to the person Silvana had come to love and admire. Having spent time working for a private detective agency when she was younger, instinct overrode caution, and she began a meticulous search for clues. Predictably, Rhea's shop keys were lying on the bedside table. More unexpected was the discovery of another set of keys attached to a ring with a tag labeled "Cellar." "Are you all right?" Patrick called up from the bottom of the staircase. "I'm okay." Silvana tucked the cellar keys into her bag. Then she remembered Rhea's present and opened it. She was surprised to find a pay-as-you-go phone, already charged up. "Well," Patrick exclaimed, "did you find anything?" "Just this." She gave him the passport. "That's odd. It appears she never made it to New Zealand after all. Maybe it's time to involve the police." "What? Right now?" "It is rather late. I doubt they'll want to be disturbed tonight." Patrick thought of the half-opened bottle of wine waiting back home. "I'll act tomorrow morning. Shall I walk you back?" "No need. I can take care of myself," Silvana said firmly. The moon was her only companion as Silvana descended the cellar steps at the back of the shop. With growing unease, she encased her hands in a pair of gloves and took off her shoes. She didn't want anyone to know of her presence. After 3 attempts, the door creaked open, and she was met by a cloying damp, overlaid by something else. Something unpleasant. Tensing, she flicked on her phone torch and spotted a narrow corridor with another door at the end. Filled with foreboding, she slowly turned the handle. She smelt the body before she saw it. Wearing the trademark hoodie, the bloating, discolored thing in front of her could hardly be called human. Judd lay slumped against an upturned table, his eyes staring and opaque. Silvana covered her face with a handkerchief to prevent retching and inspected the scene, noting the bloodied head and smashed vase lying beside it. The blood had pooled and dried, staining the clothes and floor. She was no expert, but if the rotting undertones were anything to go by, death had probably occurred a few days earlier. Even then, horror was blunted by relief. So long as it wasn't Rhea, she had the strength for anything. But where was Rhea? Adjusting to the dimness, Silvana tried to make sense of her surroundings. Some crudely constructed shelves filled with storage tubs and packets lay stacked against one of the walls. The place was obviously some kind of drugs den. Could Judd's death have been the result of a disagreement with other gang members? Silvana's stomach lurched. What if they turned up and found her? She'd only just locked the cellar door and picked up her shoes when she heard voices on the driveway. Somehow, she managed to scramble behind one of the bins underneath the fire escape. Hardly daring to breathe, she waited until the scuffling feet passed and the gang disappeared down the cellar steps. Then, she bolted into the night as fast as her trembling legs would carry her. She would decide what to do when she got home. Halfway across the town's park, muffled ringtones came from her bag. Silvana? The voice was clear as day at the other end of the line. Rhea, is it really you? Thank God. Are you all right? Where are you calling from? Talk to me. If I tell you, you must keep it to yourself. Rhea said urgently. Of course. By the way, I had your keys. The shop keys? The cellar keys. Long story. I have just been down there. I found him. Judd, dead. It was horrible. Silvana began to laugh hysterically as the shock kicked in. You went into the cellar? Rhea repeated. Why? I needed to know if you were all right. I was so afraid I was going to find you, not him. When I saw your passport, I knew you couldn't have gone abroad, that something must have happened. I didn't get the chance. What happened? I will tell you, but not now, not on the phone. Patrick is planning to go to the police tomorrow about your passport. Rhea asked, did you touch anything when you went into the cellar? Did you touch him? No. Silvana's teeth were chattering from shock. It's cold outside. I was wearing gloves, but what do you know about Judd? Why were you wearing gloves? I don't know. I had a bad feeling. I didn't want to be implicated in anything. Back home, I once worked at a detective agency. I learned about not touching crime scenes. You may want to call the police, Rhea said, but please can I ask you not to tell them I got in contact or about me giving you the phone. We'll meet soon. That is, if you want to. I'll understand if you don't want anything more to do with me. Of course I want to meet you. It seems silly pretending now. It's all I think about. Silvana's heart flipped when she saw the distant figure standing on the pier below. The matinee performance at the Pavilion Theater was in full swing, and the pier was almost deserted. She came up behind Rhea, patting her on the shoulder. Hey! Rhea turned, instantly relaxing when she saw her friend. Hey! Silvana sank into Rhea's arms. For a long time, the pair embraced. It's so good to see you, Silvana said. Likewise. Rhea glanced round. Does anyone know you're here? No, and I'm so hungry. Rhea grinned. How about some fish and chips? I'll treat you. You mean the famous English fish and chips? Rhea grinned. I've discovered a great place on the front. She linked arms with Silvana. Come on, let's eat. Then I'll tell you everything. Judd was a bad lot, Rhea admitted later. He was running a drug racket and I threatened to report him to the police. It doesn't surprise me, but how did you find out? Not long after I joined the shop, I was clearing up one of the back rooms and came across a discarded cabinet. There were 2 sets of cellar keys in it. I never told anyone about them, partly because I didn't want a lot of fuss. I wanted to keep it to myself. Unfortunately, Judd caught me coming up the stairs one evening and demanded to store his things. There. I didn't like the way he spoke to me. When I refused, he threatened to torture. There would be time enough to ask about the first time, Silvana thought, clasping Rhea's hand. I'm afraid there's more, Rhea said dully. You probably won't want anything to do with me when you hear the rest. Silvana clutched Rhea's hand more tightly. She'd come too far to be brushed aside. Why don't you let me be the judge of that? She said firmly. Whatever it is, we'll bear it together. You see, I love you. I need you to know that. You do. For a moment, Rhea's face shone. That's a relief, she said, laughing. I thought it was just me. Did you? Silvana laughed too. I may have had my suspicions, but I didn't want to say anything. Oh, I'm so happy, Silvana said. But hold your horses before we get carried away, Rhea warned. Hold my horses. An English expression. It means don't count your chickens. Count my chickens? Silvana, my love, let me finish my story before you say anything. Ugh. Sorry. Silvana nibbled a stray chip. Rhea was smiling in spite of everything. In the end, I couldn't stand being held to ransom by a bully like Judd. A few days ago, I foolishly decided to confront him in the cellar. He went to grab a knife from the table. There was an old jar on one of the shelves, and as he turned, I smashed it over his head. She shuddered. I couldn't tell you all this, but I made sure you had the phone before I left. I hoped you'd stay in touch. The day after I headed here, not wanting to be traced, I paid for everything with cash. But surely the police will realize you only acted in self-defense, Silvana insisted. Perhaps I should have gone to them straight away. But I couldn't face it. Rhea's hesitation was palpable. Especially considering what? In spite of the warmth between them, Silvana felt a sudden chill like someone walking over a grave. What aren't you telling me? Rhea's voice broke. I'm terminally ill. At best, I only have months to live. At worst, it will be weeks. I have all the medication I need. I just want to spend my last days in a place with happy memories. I can't believe it. But Silvana knew Rhea was speaking the truth. She tried to disguise her anguish. How long have you known? She whispered. I only found out for certain the day before Judd threatened me in the cellar. Maybe I wasn't thinking straight. I should have told the police everything long before. But by then, I was in too deep. I'm going to stay with you. Silvana had never been more certain of anything. Rhea shook her head. Stay with me tonight and go back tomorrow. It won't be long before the police check the cellar. It will look odd if you're not there. I have every faith in your survival skills. Look how far you've come. In the meantime, there's something I want you to have. What is it? Rhea handed Silvana 2 envelopes. Inside one is a plan of the cellar. After years of searching, I think I may have finally uncovered the sealed entrance to a tunnel leading to the old priory. My father was a historian and suspected there might be one near the shop. The other is a copy of my will. It's my final and dearest wish to make your life better when I've gone. Trigger warning. Death religion. Archie laid on his stomach with only a single headlamp to cut through the absolute darkness surrounding him. The smooth stone underneath his body was damp. The cold seeped through his polyester layers of skin-tight caving gear and bit at his flesh. A ceiling of the same black rock pressed down against his shoulders. There was barely a foot between the two layers of bedrock. He inched forward, dragging himself through the tight crevice buried under the earth. He used all his strength. His muscles burned with the effort. Struggling to keep his breaths under control, Archie forced himself to focus. The hot air, dust, and silence would not break him. Every rise of his chest filled the precious space that he had available to move, and so staying calm was vital to making any progress. Resisting the oppression he felt pressing in on all sides was his only thought. The shaking white light of his torch bounced across the walls but was consumed by a darkness just ahead, which was a good sign. It meant the crawl space was opening out to a larger area. He just had to keep going. Maybe bringing a partner wouldn't have been the worst idea. A distraction right now would be welcome. He had regretted entering the contest alone almost immediately after beginning. Safety wasn't a concern because there were so many people traversing through the cave system that day, so if he got into any trouble, he wouldn't have been alone for very long. He had failed to consider the moral support having someone with you provided, though, and was paying the price for his bravado. Come on, Archie. You've made it through worse trails than this. Just a little further. He pushed forward another inch, his fingers and toes clawing his body weight between the immovable sides of the tunnel. Another push and his fingertips crested an edge. He could bend them over into an open space where the air felt cooler and less stagnant. Finally, relaxing his neck, he let out a sigh of relief that blew a cloud of dust up into his face. Damn it! Blinded, he paused to suck in a deep breath, and then tried to blink the grit free. Every attempted slap of his eyelids resulted in a shot of pain to both irises. His elbows were not able to bend to get his hands to his face, and the dirt wouldn't shift on its own. There was nothing for it. He would have to get clear first. Archie braced his toes against the stone and hauled himself forward another fraction, then stopped dead. The pressure against his shoulders and chest held firm. He wrenched again and didn't move at all. Stuck. Blind. Alone. Stay calm. Stay calm. Stay calm. Stay calm. He wriggled on the spot, trying to find a gap. Pushed a little more. Nothing. He shook again, then again until he lost his cool and started thrashing around in place, uncontrolled and in complete desperation to move anywhere. He began gulping in breaths but couldn't get any air. Blind, he started scraping his face on the stone. He needed the pain in his eyes to stop. He needed to see. Help! Oh God, someone please! Help! God help me! Get me out! His flapping hands grazed something warm. Then the other did the same. What? Until they connected again, and he recognized the soft palms of another person, who after a few attempts lined up their fingers and was able to grip hold of both of his hands. He clamped down. Hard. Push when I pull you. Ready? Go. A feminine voice resounded off the walls of the crawl space. Archie pushed with everything he had. The pain in his wrists and shoulders was evidence of the force his mystery savior was using. For a moment he didn't move, and that panic gripped his heart once more, threatening to collapse his chest inward. Then all at once he slid forward, all resistance gone, and fell into an open cavern bundling on top of another living being. His rescuer pushed him off, and as he rolled onto his side, he broke into maniacal laughter, rubbing his eyes raw with his knuckles. Oh, thank God. He said, I thought I was done for. God had nothing to do with it. The voice said, "Definitely female. I pulled you out of there. You're welcome, by the way." "Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry. I was panicking. I got grit in my eyes, you see, and I couldn't clear it," he said, still unable to open them. "Here, tilt your head back," she said. Archie did as he was told and felt the sweet release of water against his face. Blinking away the liquid, his sight returned, and out of the blur resolved a young, slight-framed woman dressed in red and black. She had on a bandana to keep her long red curls from her face, and was barefoot. "That's so much better. Thank you, I mean it. My name is Archie," he said, holding out a hand. She didn't take it but replied instead, "Abby. No sweat, you didn't belong stuck in there." She pushed her water bottle back into a holster at her waist and looked around the cavern, illuminating it with her own head torch that blinded him all over again every time she pointed it his direction. He followed her light with his own, seeing a space no more than 3 strides across and a ceiling only just reaching above their heads. On the opposite side from where he had emerged were 4 different exits. "Where's the marker?" he asked. "There isn't one." "What do you mean?" "There should be a marker at every junction to highlight the course," he said, jumping his light between all the openings. "I don't know. Do you see one?" she asked, helplessness bleeding from her tone, and her torch snapping into his eyes looking for an answer. "No. Well, which passage did you come from? That would rule one out," Archie asked, raising his hands against the light. She didn't look at any of the openings, and simply said to the ground, "Oh, down below." "Down below? What does that mean?" She laughed, and through the giggles said, "From hell, obviously. I'm a demon, come to drag you back with me." "Yeah. Good one," Archie replied. People made strange jokes in tense situations. "Look, you're obviously a pro. I never seen anyone run the course barefoot before. Do you know the way out? Mind if I stick with you for the rest of the way?" She took the strap from her head and set the torch upright on the ground, flooding the natural room with the artificial LEDs and casting shadows on every surface. He saw her then as more than a dim silhouette, her athletic body and beauty, mesmerizing him briefly before he refocused on the task at hand. "Yeah, I know where we need to go," she said, a broad and encompassing smile spreading across her face. "Can't be going anywhere with someone I don't know and can't trust, though. Tell me about yourself, Archie. Who are you exactly?" Perplexed by such a large question, Archie stuttered and glanced around at the rocks littering the corners of the circular cave. "Come on now," she said, perching against one of those rocks. "If anyone knows who you are, I'd have thought it'd be you." "Yeah, of course. I just, don't know where to start." He rubbed the back of his neck and produced a fake grin. "I'm married, got a daughter too, so you know, I guess that makes me pretty solid, right?" "Right?" she imitated. "I work in finance. I do very well for myself, actually, if I'm honest. But you know the office job. It can be pretty sedentary. That's why I'm here, pushing myself. I took up caving a while ago, and love it. What happened just now was a first. I'm usually very good under pressure. Never freaked out like that." Okay," she said, standing and walking over to the narrow tunnel Archie had been yanked from. She ran her fingers over the edges and then said at almost a whisper, "Got any secrets?" "Who doesn't?" "Okay, well, ever done anything you're truly ashamed of?" "Like what?" he asked, still standing in the same spot. "Oh, I don't know. Are you a gambler?" "Must be if you work in finance." "Sure, I guess. I've done a few casinos with the guys before. One big once too. Nice, she said. Never lost? Well, losing's part of the deal. You learned that in my game. As long as you keep playing, though, things always come around, he said, puffing his chest high, confidence brimming from his stance. What about the ultimate gamble? Ever cheated on that wife of yours? He smiled then, and wandered the few paces to where she stood, stopping a little too close to her, and keeping his eyes fixed on hers, a trick he'd learned to appear powerful to women. Depends, he said. Who's offering? She giggled and moved past him to the other side of the tiny underground enclosure. All right, one more question and then I'll decide if we go on together. Sound good? Sure, he said, examining her more greedily as their conversation went on. Do you believe? He scrunched his face up and looked at her with confusion. Believe? You mean in religion, God? No, of course not. Funny. You were screaming for God to help you when you thought you were stuck in there. Then you thanked him when you were free. Now you don't believe? It was just an expression, Archie said, losing interest fast. Look, if you know the way out of here, we really should get moving. The course is long and I'd like to get back. Abby stood up on her toes, stretching and plastering that giant smile on her face again. Okay, it's been an easy decision to make anyway. You can come with me. I'll get you where you need to go. Great, Archie said. You won't regret it. You can trust me. It was her turn to look confused then, cocking her head to one side. Oh, I can't trust you at all. No, you lied in every answer to my questions. You have so many secrets, Archie. She said, stepping closer, her body casting a giant black shadow on the wall. I know you gambled big on the small business account and lost. All those families are going to be closing their ventures and out on the street, their children suffering with hungry bellies because of you. Then you blamed it on the junior. Poor guy will never work in the industry again. It was his dream, you know. She did a pirouette then, arms pointed in the air and everything. I also know you've slept with 3 other women since you made those vows to your wife in the grandest church you could find. She doesn't have a clue, does she, Archie? She thinks the world of you. You know that. And you even tried to hit on me. Down here of all places. He began to stutter a retort to this woman's accusations, but managed only a single phrase. Who the hell are you? Abby giggled and ran a full circle around the cavern. Do you know that's the first question you've asked me that hasn't been self-serving? Although I guess you could argue, given the circumstances now, that asking about me is still for your own benefit. Anyway, I told you who I am. I'm Abby, Abaddon if you like, and I'm from hell. Get it right. I told you all this earlier. I don't lie or keep secrets. Not like you. What is this? Archie yelled. This is no time or place for a prank. Freaking people out when they're down here is dangerous. It's not funny. No, you're right. It's not funny, Abby said, cocking her head to one side and gazing into the distance. Oh, we almost forgot the last question. Another lie. You do believe in God. Just only when it serves your own needs, it seems. You keep that little secret buried real deep. Ashamed to have faith. Are we? Archie flashed his head torch around the room, looking for a way out of this insanity. When he didn't find it, he faced her again. What do you want? Money? You can have as much as you like to keep your mouth shut. Abby tipped back her head as far as it would go, opened her mouth a little wider than seemed possible, and belted a roaring laugh that seemed to echo from every direction. She snapped her head back down in an instant, cutting her amusement off dead. I don't want money. I want your soul, silly. Look, just tell me the way out, and I'll get out of here. You won't see me ever again, whoever you are. Archie said, his feet shifting and sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. Abby ran over to the wall with the 4 exits then, and stood in the center of them, arms outstretched. Surprise! They are all the right one. They all go to the same place, so you were never in any danger of going the wrong way, Archie. Wait, what? Archie said, shaking his head. Yeah, they all head downward. If you'd admitted your failings and repented, I could have sent you back up. But as it was, you didn't even think to set your head torch down like I did. You just kept shining that thing in my eyes without caring. You're a real piece of work, Archie. I still don't know what this is. He said, maybe you're crazy, or this is some kind of setup. But either way, I just need to get out of here. Plus, it's ridiculous. I'd have to be dead to be sent to hell, and I'm right here. Your little game doesn't even make sense. Abby skipped back across the cavern again, sending little stones shooting across the floor until she was staring down the gap Archie had come from. Come take a look, she whispered. With no other option, Archie walked over and looked down the tunnel. There he saw, illuminated in the white light, his own face. Gray with open, lifeless eyes, slack-jawed and vacant. His own dead body. Yay. Heart attacks will do that to you when you're stuck in a hole a mile underground. Abby giggled. Archie stumbled backwards, falling and landing with his back to one of the 4 exits. Head in hands, he sobbed and whispered prayers for God to save him. Too late for that. Abby laughed. You made this so easy, Archie. I only had to ask a bare handful of questions and the decision was made. We didn't even get to the way you look at your teenage daughter's friends, or the way you treated your parents. Maybe if you'd even just once looked at another person like a human being, shown 1 ounce of empathy, we could have negotiated. But nope, downward it is. She stood back, pressed the heel of her dirty foot into chest, and pushed him backward into the open tunnel. She waved and giggled as he fell through the chute and into the abyss below. The world slowed the moment the car hit me. I didn't hear the screech of the tires or the sickening thud of my body against the hood. Instead, there was silence, an unnatural void. Time unraveled, stretching thin as I hit the pavement. My bones cracked like brittle twigs, and blood pooled in my mouth, but my thoughts were somewhere distant, disjointed. I opened my eyes to find myself lying on the playground across the street. The world felt wrong. The edges of my vision blurred, everything dim and colorless. A deep, throbbing ache spread through me, but the pain was distant, like it belonged to someone else. I sat up, and the familiar setting of the playground twisted in my mind. I hadn't been here in years. Why was I here now? The sky hung low and oppressive, an endless gray void. The swing stood motionless, the rusted slide loomed like a grave marker, and the merry-go-round sagged under the weight of decay, its faded colors giving it a sick, diseased appearance. I looked at my hands, blood-stained but not enough. Shouldn't there be more? Shouldn't I feel more? A cold dread began to creep in. My phone, I thought. I should call for help. But when I reached into my pocket, it wasn't there. Of course, it wasn't. I looked across the street to where the accident had happened, but the intersection had dissolved into a dense, rolling fog, thick and heavy, like it had swallowed the world whole. Panic twisted in my chest, its claws sinking deep. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled, barely able to support me. My vision blurred again, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt. The air felt wrong, too thick, too cold. Something dark slithered in the back of my mind, something I couldn't shake. Then I heard it. Laughter. It cut through the silence like a razor. high-pitched and sweet, but it sent a chill racing down my spine. Slowly, I turned. On the swing set, barely brushing the ground with her feet, sat a little girl in a red dress. Her dark brown hair hung in two neat braids, and she swayed gently, her laughter soft and melodic. But it wasn't just any girl. It was me. Me, at 8 years old. I felt my stomach lurch, acid rising in my throat. This wasn't possible. The dress, the shoes, the way she sat. It was all too familiar. Too real. My heart pounded in my chest, a cold sweat breaking across my skin. I wanted to look away, but my eyes were locked on her. She smiled at me, an eerie, knowing grin that sent waves of nausea through me. "Come play," she said, her voice light and innocent. But there was something beneath it, something dark, something twisted. I stumbled back, my limbs shaking uncontrollably. This couldn't be happening. The fog had crept closer, surrounding the playground like a living, breathing thing, thick and suffocating. My breath hitched as I realized there was no way out. Nowhere to run. "Come on, play with me," she whispered, her voice carrying through the fog. I turned, wanting to escape. But when I looked back, she was standing right in front of me. Too close. Far too close. Her eyes were wrong. Dark, hollow, as if something else was staring out from behind them. And her smile, it stretched too wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that no child should ever have. "I've been waiting for you," she hissed, her voice low and sinister. "You promised you'd come back." I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, my throat tight, every instinct screaming at me to run, to move. But I couldn't. I was frozen, paralyzed by her gaze. The little girl giggled, the sound grating and unnatural, her face contorting with amusement. "Oh, you remember, you said you'd come back and stay, forever." My pulse quickened, fear clawing at the edges of my sanity. "I never—" "Yes, you did," she interrupted, stepping even closer. I could feel the cold radiating off her, seeping into my bones. "And now you're here, just like you promised." Time blurred after that. I ran, or tried to. But every time I reached the edge of the playground, the fog pushed me back, like some twisted, invisible force was playing with me. It felt like an eternity, wandering in circles, desperate to escape, only to end up back at the swings. Back to her. She never left. Always there. Always waiting. The nights were worse. When I collapsed from exhaustion, sleep brought no peace. My dreams twisted into nightmares, repeating the accident over and over. But in some dreams, I wasn't hit by the car. I walked into it, willingly. My body moving without my control, like a puppet on strings. In others, I stood in the playground, watching the car barrel toward me, but feeling no pain, only a heavy, crushing sense of inevitability. The fog never lifted. The little girl never disappeared. Days, weeks, I couldn't tell anymore. Time slipped away, each moment bleeding into the next. My body began to change. I looked gaunt, my skin pale and stretched tight over my bones. My reflection in the broken mirror of the slide was unrecognizable, some ghostly version of myself. The girl, on the other hand, seemed to grow. Taller, sharper, darker. She was no longer the child I remembered, but something else. Something wrong. "Why are you doing this to me?" I whispered one night, my voice hoarse and broken from days of screaming. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable, but her eyes gleamed with something like pity. "You did this to yourself," she murmured. "You wanted to escape. You didn't want to grow up, don't you remember?" Her words struck deep, bringing with them a flood of memories I'd long buried. The fear of growing older, the crushing weight of expectations, the endless anxiety that gnawed at me every day. Hadn't I wished for this? Hadn't I wanted to escape it all? I couldn't deny it anymore. This was my punishment, my price for wanting to go back, for refusing to face the world. The playground had claimed me, and now it would never let go. Now I sit on the swing next to her. The fog presses in on all sides, but it no longer suffocates me. The little girl is no longer separate from me. We are one and the same. And I swing back and forth in this endless gray world. I was always meant to stay here. A thin veil of fog, like a river of mist, enveloped London's streets on that damp November morning. Jeremy Siegel, a man barely past 48, pulled his coat tighter, adjusted his hat, unfurled his umbrella, and gripped his briefcase as he emerged from the subway. His youthful appearance belied his age, betrayed only by his receding hairline. His tall frame and confident stride suggested a man of assuredness, a stark contrast to his inner turmoil. Lost in thought, he barely noticed the stranger who collided with his shoulder. Startled, he turned to see only a retreating figure in a dark coat, hood pulled low. As he continued his walk, he felt something beneath his foot. Stooping, he retrieved a small USB drive. Assuming it belonged to the person he'd encountered, he searched the crowd, but the stranger had vanished. With a glance at the clock, he realized he was running late and hastily pocketed the drive, hurrying towards his destination. PK. Wow. Oh, hi. As the clock ticked closer to the end of his workday, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his tired eyes. His prolonged computer work had left them stinging. Reaching into his pocket, he accidentally brushed against the USB drive he'd found earlier. A thoughtful look crossed his face as he surveyed the office. The brokerage firm's workspace was a maze of identical cubicles, each enclosed by opaque glass and aluminum, offering a sense of privacy. Yet, the only way to see what someone else was working on was to stand directly behind them. The room was filled with the steady rhythm of typing and the low hum of indistinct conversations. As he inserted the USB drive, a folder labeled "Strictly Confidential" popped up on his screen. Intrigued, he clicked the file. A peculiar sight unfolded. A short, rosy-cheeked man, impeccably dressed in a tuxedo, danced gleefully across the screen, waving a cane in hand. A burst of cheerful music accompanied his performance. A flush of color crept across Jeremy's face as he yanked the drive out. A deathly silence had fallen over the office. His breath caught in his throat. Seconds ticked by, agonizingly slow. Then, a faint tapping began. A second followed. Gradually, the familiar hum of conversation returned, washing away his fear. After his long day at work, Jeremy stepped out into the crisp evening air. The rain had finally subsided, leaving the city streets damp and glistening under the streetlights. He made his way to the underground station, his departure time imminent. The platform was eerily empty, save for an elderly woman hunched over her cane. It was an unusual sight during rush hour. Suddenly, the elderly woman began to cough, her body racked by a sudden fit. Alarmed, Jeremy approached her, but she seemed unresponsive. Before he could react, she stumbled and tumbled onto the tracks. Heart-pounding, Jeremy raced towards her. The woman lay sprawled on the rails, gasping for air. A wave of panic washed over him as he hesitated. Then, with a surge of courage, he jumped down to her aid. The approaching train's whistle pierced the air, a stark reminder of the danger. As he reached for the woman, a chilling sight met his eyes. Instead of the elderly woman, a young girl stood before him, her white hair shimmering in the dim light. Her eyes, a piercing blue, held an unsettling coldness. With a swift movement, she slipped away from his grasp and leaped onto the platform. Jeremy turned to see the train hurtling towards him. In a desperate act, he grabbed the girl's hand, his fingers closing around the icy skin. Then, with a jarring jolt, he found himself standing on the platform, the train screeching to a halt. The station was suddenly alive with noise and commotion. People had appeared from nowhere, boarding the train. Yet, no one seemed to have noticed the extraordinary events that had just transpired. The girl was gone, vanished as mysteriously as she had appeared. Jeremy shook his head, a sense of bewilderment washing over him. He boarded the train, the doors sliding shut behind him, leaving him alone with the memory of the ghostly encounter. The jostling crowd made him feel claustrophobic. His breath came in heavy gasps. He braced himself against a pole, doing his best to avoid contact with the other passengers. Was it all a dream? If so, how and when had it happened? His hand was still numb from the girl's icy touch. The train came to a halt. It was time to disembark. He straightened his coat and headed home. The stale air hit him like a physical blow as he entered his apartment. He kicked off his boots, tossed his coat onto an armchair, and dropped his briefcase on the table. He flicked on the heater, a fleeting luxury afforded by his meager salary. He was forced to ration its use, turning it off during the day to conserve energy. With a weary sigh, he retrieved a canned meal from the cupboard, emptied it onto a plate, sat down at his computer, and began to eat ravenously. Jeremy Segal, beyond his morning job at the brokerage firm, had another, less lucrative pursuit: writing. It was a dream he had nurtured since childhood, but his aspirations had fallen short of reality. So he found himself working as a ghostwriter, his words bringing success to others, while his own name remained hidden in the shadows. Each time he saw his work published under someone else's name, he wrestled with a complex internal battle. His pride yearned for recognition, while his conscience urged him to remain silent. He clenched his fists and gritted his teeth, a silent protest against the injustice. The success he had crafted with his own pen was a bittersweet victory, a triumph that belonged to someone else. He gulped down a mouthful of beans and opened his emails. They were inundated with feedback from his latest client, nitpicking comments about his phrasing, grammar, and even the vocabulary he'd used to describe the project. Frustrated, he slammed his fist on the table and shut his laptop. Jeremy was one of those people who believed problems could be solved by ignoring them. He snorted, muttering, "Ingrates. They have no appreciation for my work. They think I'm lucky to give them my writing for such a paltry sum." He stood up abruptly, pushed back his chair, and grabbed a cold beer from the fridge. Downing it in one gulp, he wiped his mouth with his sleeve and tossed the can into the sink. "One day," he growled, his teeth clenched, "I'll be famous. They'll see. They'll beg me." He cursed under his breath. The client's nitpicking corrections were driving him mad. He grabbed his coat, but a USB drive slipped from its pocket. He picked it up. Back at his computer, he lowered the volume and inserted the drive. A familiar figure appeared on the screen, a short, rosy-cheeked man in a tuxedo, twirling a cane. Upbeat music filled the room as he danced. The man stopped, tapping his cane 6 times in the corner of the screen. A red ribbon unfurled, revealing a message written in dripping red paint. "Congratulations," it read. "You are one of the lucky ones we chose to fulfill your deepest desire. Click on the folder and your dreams will come true." A crimson folder pulsed on the screen. Jeremy's heart pounded. Surely it was a virus. He ripped the USB drive out, but the image persisted. He furrowed his brow, tapped away at the keyboard, but nothing budged. Desperation mounting, he shut down the computer, only to see the image reappear when he restarted it. Grabbing his phone, he frantically searched for a technician. Calling the first number he found, he prayed for a miracle, hoping the promised 24-hour service was real. A moment later, a man in a burgundy vest, white shirt, black bow tie, and trousers stood at the doorway. He smiled, and a mouthful of gold teeth gleamed. "Jeremy Siegel?" he inquired, his voice dripping with a peculiar cheeriness. Jeremy, taken aback by the man's odd attire for a computer technician, nodded. "I'm David," the man said, offering a handshake that sent a chill down Jeremy's spine. His hand was as cold as ice. "You called about a computer issue. Mind if I take a look?" "Of course," Jeremy replied. David strode in, his eyes scanning the room with a practiced smile. "So, this is the patient?" he asked, gesturing towards the computer. "Yes," Jeremy confirmed. The technician sat down, his gaze locking onto the screen. "Well, well," he mused, a knowing glint in his eye. "Looks like a nasty virus. How did you manage to catch it?" Jeremy hesitated. "I plugged in a USB drive, and now this image is stuck. I've tried everything, but it won't budge." David stroked his chin, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Must be quite urgent then," he observed, "to call a technician at this hour." "It's work," Jeremy explained. "I have a tight deadline." "Deadlines? Deadlines," David echoed, a hint of sympathy in his voice. David's eyes were glued to the screen, his fingers dancing across the keyboard. Jeremy watched him, a sense of unease growing within him. "At least, I love my job," David said, his voice a low rumble. "It's in my blood. Give me computers, take my soul." His eyes met Jeremy's, a chilling intensity in his gaze. "Just saying, of course," he added, returning his attention to the screen. "I like my job too," Jeremy replied, his voice hesitant. "I hear a doubt in your tone," David observed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Let's just say things could be better," Jeremy said cautiously. "There's always room for improvement," David replied, his voice laced with a hint of menace. "In my case, there's a lot of room," Jeremy admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Then the question is, what are you willing to do to change things for the better?" David asked, his eyes boring into Jeremy's. Jeremy leaned forward, his resolve faltering. "I'd give even my soul," he whispered. David smiled, a chillingly cold expression on his face. He clicked the mouse, and the image on the screen vanished. "Done!" he exclaimed, his voice filled with a strange triumph. Jeremy stood up, a mixture of relief and dread washing over him. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. The technician pulled a document from his bag. "Please sign here. It's a confirmation that we solved your problem." Jeremy complied, his hand trembling slightly. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing, Mr. Siegel. It's company policy not to charge our customers anything the first time. You'll pay us next time." "Hopefully there won't be a next time," Jeremy joked, trying to sound light-hearted. David didn't speak. He smiled broadly, his gold teeth gleaming ominously. "Until next time, Mr. Siegel," he said, his voice a chilling farewell. Jeremy shivered as David's icy hand clasped his own. The next morning, panic-stricken, he sprinted toward the metro, the doors closing just as he reached the platform. His hat tumbled into the yawning gap between train and platform. As the train lurched forward, he glanced out the window, his heart pounding. He swore he saw a girl with white hair and piercing blue eyes pick up his hat and place it on her head. The scene vanished as the train accelerated, leaving him unsure if it was a fleeting glimpse of reality or a figment of his imagination. He squeezed through the crowd, finding the only empty seat. His eyes fell on a petite, dark-haired girl clutching her bag tightly, her gaze darting nervously around. She wore the smallest shoes he'd ever seen. Suddenly, words began to flow from his mind, a torrent of inspiration he couldn't contain. He pulled out his phone and started typing. He saw her tiny bare feet walking in the darkness. She was desperately trying to find a way out, but kept stumbling over nails and mud. Her blood had formed a thin stream. He closed his eyes, greedily inhaling its scent. The time had come. He emerged from the shadows and began his gruesome game. So engrossed was he that he almost missed his stop. He continued writing, his mind racing, as he walked to the office, worked, and returned home. A sudden inspiration had begun to overflow without stopping. And this was only the beginning. A year later, a sea of faces filled the grand ballroom for the launch of Jeremy Sigel's debut novel, Steps in the Dark. The book, published by the country's most prestigious publishing house, had already sparked discussions for translation and film adaptations. As the event drew to a close, Jeremy signed the last copy, a surge of pride washing over him. The room emptied, and he bent down to gather his belongings. A sudden burst of applause startled him. He looked up, his heart pounding. A man with hair as white as snow and eyes the color of the sky was approaching him from the back of the room. A chill ran down his spine. "Congratulations, Mr. Sigel," the man exclaimed, his applause finally ceasing. He stood before Jeremy's desk, his gaze piercing. Jeremy swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He met the man's gaze defiantly, rising to his feet. "Thank you very much, Mer. Helway, Damon Helway," he introduced himself, extending a chillingly cold hand. The sensation was familiar, a haunting echo from the past. "Your book is truly inspiring," Damon continued, his voice laced with admiration. "The way you've captured the victim's torment and the killer's twisted psychology is masterful. Thank you again. But how do you know all this? It was released today at this presentation. Have you already read it? I don't recall you being among those who purchased a copy, and I signed." The man's smile was blinding, his teeth gleaming under the spotlights. "Is it possible not to know the book I wrote?" he chuckled. "You!" Jeremy exclaimed, disbelief etched on his face. "How on earth?" "I wrote the book. It's the result of an agreement you made a year ago," Damon interrupted, his voice calm and menacing. "What agreement? I don't?" "A year ago you found a USB stick on the street, didn't you?" "How?" "Do you remember what appeared on the computer screen when the man in the tuxedo stopped dancing?" "A red ribbon, but—" "And what did the ribbon do?" "It formed a phrase, which said, 'You are one of the lucky ones we chose to fulfill your deepest desire. Click on the folder and your dreams will come true,'" he replied, as if he were seeing the words before him. "I don't understand." "I'll explain it to you right away, Mr. Sigel," Damon said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You published your first book, a book with the potential to be a worldwide bestseller. Your wish came true." "But I didn't," Jeremy stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Good evening, Mr. Sigel." He jumped. David, the technician, materialized beside him. His clothes were the same, his gold teeth glinting oddly. "What's going on?" Jeremy sputtered, his mind racing. Sweat beaded on his forehead. David shrugged nonchalantly. Do you remember what you told me when I asked what you were willing to do to change things for the better?" Jeremy was silent for a moment, his eyes wide with fear. "I would even give my soul," he muttered. David clapped his hands triumphantly. "Exactly. Did you think all this inspiration suddenly sprang from your mind? Did you really believe that? Did you think that from a simple and not even that good ghostwriter, you would become a famous writer? Is that the kind of delusions you harbor?" "But how?" Jeremy began, his voice trembling. "It's simple, Mr. Sigel," Damon interrupted, leaning in. "Without my intervention, you'd be nothing. A lackey taking abuse from your boss. A miserable soul watching others live out their dreams, signed by your own hand. But now, he winked. "Remember the document David had you sign when you agreed to sell your soul for your dream? Our deal is sealed, and it can't be undone." Suddenly, Jeremy realized the significance of the man's name standing before him. "What?" he stammered, sinking into his chair. "What do you want?" "Don't you remember?" David began. "I told you we never take payment up front from our clients. We get paid later. So it's time to collect what you owe us." What do I owe you?" Sweat continued to pour down his face. Damon leaned in closer, his eyes flashing literally. "I want you to write for me. Everything I show you, everything I tell you. It's time for an upgrade, Jeremy. Until now, you were just a ghostwriter. Now, you'll become my personal hell writer." Jeremy swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. Damon extended his hand. David returned a sinister smile, winking at him. Jeremy hesitated, but then reached out to shake Damon's hand. A chill ran down his spine, numbing his body. He covered his face with his hands, his eyes wide with terror. He knew there was no escape, no turning back. The hidden. Precisely 2 weeks after my 15th birthday, on a mild and bright October afternoon, I saw a man get hit by a car. Although I was deeply afraid of what I might see, there was nobody else who could help. The road was otherwise deserted. I ran over to the driver, who was frantic and in hysterical tears. I tried to calm him down, told him we needed to call an ambulance, but he insisted there was no time. We must drive straight to the hospital. It was the only way. Anything I had ever read or watched on TV had made it clear to me that moving an injured person was very bad, but I was powerless to stop the rising panic of the situation, stomping my shaky protest into the dirt. With all other avenues of logic and reason closed off, I found myself helping to lift the injured man into the car. In the back seat, with his head on my lap, I noticed for the first time how strikingly beautiful he was. He was not injured in any visible way, except for a bright smear of blood across his forehead. But even that small visceral offense caused me discomfort. I wiped it away with a crumpled tissue I found in my pocket. His skin was pale and flawless next to the jet black of his hair that fell in a thick, shiny mop. Bot down. He could not have been more than 20 years old. I silently prayed to whoever was listening for him to be spared any lasting damage caused by our hasty intervention. Some dried leaf litter was strewn through his lovely hair, and I gently began to pick it out with my thumb and forefinger. I remember how important it was to remove every single crumb of it, so I could restore him to perfection. I don't recall how long I was absorbed in this intricate task. All I know is that I was so transfixed by it, that all other concerns had drifted away, and a peaceful dreamlike state cocooned me. It was the soft dappled light flittering in through the car windows that broke my reverie, and caused me to look up from the beautiful boy, and notice that we were driving into the woods. I told the man he was going the wrong way. Said it. Then shouted it. As I was grappling with a succession of reasonable scenarios as to why this man was continuing to drive in the wrong direction, the beautiful boy opened his eyes and calmly sat up beside me. The surge of relief was overwhelming. I spoke to him in comforting words, tried to find out how he was feeling, but he remained silent and facing forwards as if I was a ghost he could neither see nor hear. His eyes were an impossibly clear and bright blue. Two jewels set into his perfect face, the effect of which doused me in calming acceptance as I waited for the ultimate plausible explanation that had to be coming. Without any discernible intention, I began looking around the car for nothing in particular, and anything at all that would make it all make sense. All the while, a tiny, almost imperceptible voice was trying to make itself heard over my placatory, dampening internal monologue. I willfully ignored it because I wasn't ready to agree with what it was saying. I kept pushing it down, but it persisted and grew louder and more urgent until it was the only voice I could hear, and it was screaming over and over. Get out! Get out! Get out now! Yet there I remained, powerless to abandon the false comfort of denial. My mind wrestling with my instincts, still hopeful, still expectant of everything to be fine. The reassuring voice fervently resisting the opposing forces that would see it silenced. This can't be happening. You must have this wrong. It's going to be fine. The voice grew quieter and less certain each time it spoke, and a third voice was now chiding me. This is what you get for taking the shortcut home from the library. You were told never to use that route. It's your own fault. My racing pulse thumped in my ears and throat, making my head feel like it was filling up with blood and drowning me. My body was leaden weight, a useless lump incapable of acting upon the one shrieking command that would not cease pummeling my brain. In one swift movement that seemed to happen regardless of any conscious control, I yanked the door handle and threw myself from the car. I landed on soft ground. Then I was somehow on my feet and running, no longer heavy. I could barely feel the earth beneath me and could hurdle any objects in my path. I ran like this for what felt like miles without tiring. When I eventually found the courage to look behind me, I could see nothing but dense woodland. I continued to run, but the fuel to sustain the speed and endurance was now spent, and I soon dropped to the ground, gasping painfully. I wasn't even sure how far it was to the road or which direction I should be heading. It was starting to get dark, and the temperature had dropped considerably. I sat for a short while, having a pointless discussion with myself about what I could do if I had only managed to grab my satchel before I jumped. Despite how the nascent idea of it knotted my insides, I knew what I had to do. The remaining light was fading rapidly, and my desperate search to find adequate shelter for the night was taking an alarming amount of time. But before total despair took hold, I came across a forest clearing. At the opposite edge was a huge, gnarly, upturned oak tree, which had lifted a good portion of the forest floor with it when it fell. A version of optimism glimmered as I approached it. The exposed roots, with a solid layer of earth above, formed a natural alcove that was as good a place as any I was likely to find. I took one last anxious look around before climbing in as far back as I could fit. The pungent smell of damp soil assaulted me from all sides, and I was barely able to stifle a scream when some existing tenant dropped onto my head. After frenziedly shaking out my hair, I zipped my coat, put up my hood, and drew the cord tight, leaving just the center of my face exposed. I tucked my jeans into my socks, pulled my hands inside my sleeves, and tucked them tight under each arm. With my swaddling arranged, I sat back against a patch of soft earth and looked out beyond the tree roots at a particularly bright rising moon set against a cloudless sky. A gratitude I had never felt before radiated towards that moon. I knew that as long as she was there, I wouldn't be all alone. That she would stay with me and spare me the terror of a night spent in total darkness. "Thank you," I whispered over and over as hot tears burst their banks and cascaded down my freezing cheeks. Although I was still wretched with fear, exhaustion eventually won out. I awoke while it was still night. The distant sound of heavy footsteps crunching over dried leaves had penetrated the fragile slumber my nerves had allowed. Searching, male voices pierced the darkness. My stomach lurched, and I clasped my hands over my mouth, terrified I might let out an involuntary whimper. I waited for them to pass, but their voices would not travel any further away. My arms ached with their solemn duty to keep me silenced. I knew if those men saw the upturned oak, they'd have the same idea as I'd had. Silent tears streamed from my eyes, along with a sudden hit of warmth in the seat of my jeans. Any minute now, any second now, they were going to find me. My whole body had tensed rigid with terror, and every muscle fiber screeched in agony. Then something was different. The voices had changed. They were no longer calling out to the little girl who was hiding. They were disagreeing. I strained to hear over the rushing of blood in my ear. The sounds became increasingly animalistic until I realized they were scuffling with one another. I considered making a dash for it while they were preoccupied. But dash where? I had no light, no way of knowing which direction to run. They'd chase me down easily. So I did the only thing I could do. The cessation of noise came more swiftly and suddenly than I was anticipating. I sat huddled, waiting for any clue that might reveal what was happening outside of my view. There was nothing. Hours passed. An angry wind had gathered pace and roared fearsomely through the clearing, taking up leaves and twigs and anything in its path. An occasional piece of hard forest detritus would hurtle in and attack my exposed face, so I placed my forehead onto my knees. For hours I remained in the same position, waiting for dawn in a dank, dark pit of roots and soil and crawling bugs. If there exist adequate words to describe the desolation of the longest, coldest, loneliest hours of my life, waiting for that night to end, I have never found them. By the time the sun had begun its ascent, I was as close to madness as I had ever been before or since. Whatever was waiting for me outside was better than remaining in that living grave. I crawled through the roots and emerged into daylight, blinking through falling soil. The cold hit me immediately. Shivering uncontrollably, I peeped over the crest of the mound. I saw only forest. Unsure whether to trust my astigmatic eyes, I squinted hard and scanned every square foot of visible forest. All was calm. There was no wind, and my ear picked up something that filled me with that same glimmer of optimism I'd had upon finding the fallen oak. It was the distant sound of running water. I was sure of it. The stream that ran through the woods. I could follow it back to the road. How had I not realized it before? It didn't matter. Hope replaced fear, and I began to walk. I hadn't gone more than 30 feet when my foot struck something under the leaves. A surge of adrenaline spiked in my chest as I realized what it was, and my head and eyes darted in all directions, seeking the threat of imminent danger. Finding none, my eyes returned to the brightly flowered pattern of my satchel, and I bent to retrieve it. I had already taken hold of it before I noticed the large white hand clasped around its top handle. An involuntary scream escaped, and I let go, stumbling backwards. After I had gathered what was left of my shattered nerves, I deduced that the hand was not attached to a living person. Revulsion slithered through my midsection. I picked up a forked twig and shakily used it at arm's length to unhook the fingers. Once I'd freed the satchel, I stood for a moment, wondering if I should move the leaves from the rest of the body just to make sure. Of what? I didn't know. In any case, I hadn't the courage, and it didn't seem important enough to try and muster it. I rifled through my bag. Everything was still in there. My glasses. My glasses. I could see. The half bottle of water was soon emptied into my parched throat. I continued my search for the stream. After a few steps, I heard a sound. I froze. Silence. A few seconds passed. There it was again. No denying what it was. No. 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 In my peripheral vision, I caught movement in the leaves not far from where the dead man lay. I was consumed with terror as I watched a figure push itself up from under a mound of leaves. The face was bloodied and grotesquely swollen, but I recognized that mop of dark hair instantly. I was primed to dart in the opposite direction, but something held me fast. A primal survival instinct that insisted it was safer to keep my eyes on him than to not. He appeared too injured to take advantage of my proximity, but I had very recently been taught not to take things at face value. After a short internal discussion, I was able to make myself walk over until I was only 5 or so feet away. He looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. He was trying to speak but could only produce that same labored, gurgling wheeze that had alerted me to his presence. As I stood there, not knowing what I should do, he slowly lifted his coat to show me the handle of a hunting knife, the blade of which had been pushed to the hilt into his rib cage. I hunched and violently expelled the paltry contents of my stomach. When I'd steadied myself, I drew a few heavy breaths and forced myself to think. I eliminated all of the options that just weren't feasible, and there was only one that remained. I never even turned back to look at him. "I'll get help," I shouted over my shoulder as I walked away. I found the stream within 10 minutes, and the road within half an hour after that. The sun was brighter now, and soft light illuminated the asphalt, endowing it with the ethereal glow of a divine path to salvation. It was early on Sunday morning. There'd be no passing cars for hours. Despite the fact I hadn't eaten and had vomited the only water I'd had in over 12 hours, I started to run. I knew if I could keep a steady pace, I was only another hour or so from home. When I reached the foot of the hill that led to my house, I broke into a sprint. A slurry of thoughts poured into my head. What would I tell my dad? How would I explain? He will have been up all night, worried sick. And poor Jess, she probably got caught up in the panic, too young to understand. I arrived at the door and let myself inside, expecting to be mobbed or to come upon some scene of emotional devastation, but the house was still. All the blinds were drawn, and aside from the dim strip lighting under the kitchen cupboards, everything was in darkness. The little jade statue of Buddha caught my eye, oddly out of place on the middle of the kitchen counter. I walked over. Underneath it was a note. "Hey, Sweet Pea. Phil was short-staffed on the night shift, so I've gone in to help him out. Jess is spending the night at Auntie Joe's, so you have the house to yourself to knuckle down with your project. Get a pizza. Money in the teapot. See you tomorrow, honey. Love, Dad. X." I ran to the phone, lifted the receiver, and began to dial, but my finger recoiled midway through and hovered over the buttons like a question mark. A seed of a thought began to germinate. A glimpse. A vision. A premonition of life marked by a narrow escape. Daughter's worlds open up gradually, grudgingly and conditionally, and in return for our liberty, we owe our safety. I replaced the receiver and stood stock still, silently locked in a fraught negotiation with my better self. When it was over, I walked over to the washing machine. I removed everything I was wearing and placed it in the drum coat, shoes, satchel, everything. I set a ruinous boil, wash, and tumble dry sequence. Accidents happen. I'd be forgiven. Then I walked, shivering, over to the bathroom and ran the hottest shower my hand could take. I stepped inside. The pain was singular. No other feelings or thoughts could invade my brain as shards of blistering water sliced at my frigid skin. I heard a faint noise, and it took a few moments to understand it was coming from me. It grew louder and stronger until my lungs could propel it no further. Once my body acclimatized to the hazardous temperature, I took the soap and began to scrub. I washed off the foulness and the filth and watched until it all swirled away from me and disappeared.